October 15th, 1859, Lexington, Kentucky. The autumn leaves fell like copper coins across the cobblestone streets, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying harvest. Inside the grand dining room of the Beaumont estate, 12 of the wealthiest plantation owners in the bluegrass region gathered for their monthly feast. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight like captured stars. Silver cutlery gleamed against white linen, and the promise of roasted duck filled the air with anticipation. What they didn't know was that in the kitchen below, Josiah Freeman stood over bubbling pots with hands that remembered everything and eyes that had stopped forgiving. For 18 years, he had served these men their finest meals while they devoured his people's freedom. Tonight, the menu would be different. Tonight, Josiah would serve justice one plate at a time, seasoned with memory and garnished with reckoning. This is the story of a cook who turned his kitchen into a courtroom, his recipes into verdicts, and his silence into the loudest scream Kentucky had ever heard. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Beaumont estate rose from the Kentucky landscape like a monument to stolen dreams. White columns stretched toward heaven as if trying to escape the earth they were built upon, while magnolia trees cast shadows that seemed to whisper secrets the house preferred to keep buried. Behind the grand facade, past the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, down a narrow staircase worn smooth by countless footsteps, lay the heart of the operation. The kitchen. It pulsed with heat, steam, and the constant rhythm of preparation. Cast iron pots hung from blackened hooks, copper kettles gleamed in the firelight, and wooden tables bore the scars of 10,000 meals prepared for men who had never said thank you. Josiah Freeman moved through this domain like a ghost who had learned to cook. Tall and lean, with hands that moved with surgical precision and eyes that missed nothing, he commanded respect from every servant in the house, not because he was cruel, but because he was patient. Dangerously patient. The kind of patience that comes from watching your world burn while keeping your face perfectly still. The kind of patience that learns to smile while planning a funeral. He had arrived at the Beaumont estate in the winter of 1841, sold at auction like livestock, separated from a wife whose name he still whispered in the dark. The kitchen became his cage and his kingdom, the place where he discovered that food was more than sustenance. It was power. Every spice told a story. Every technique held secrets. Every meal was a conversation between cook and consumer that only one of them understood. The other servants called him Quiet Josiah, the one who never raised his voice, but somehow made the loudest statements. He seasoned with precision, carved with artistry, and served with a grace that made the masters feel civilized, even as they discussed selling children like crops. But beneath that calm exterior, something else simmered. Something that had been cooking for 18 years, slow and steady, until it was ready to be served. Tonight was different. Tonight, the monthly gathering of the Bluegrass Brotherhood would convene at the Beaumont table. 12 men who owned more human souls than they could count, who traded in flesh and called it commerce, who built their fortunes on the backs of people they refused to see as people. They came to eat, drink, and plan the expansion of their empire. They never noticed that the cook who fed them had been taking notes for nearly 2 decades. Colonel Harrison Beaumont, master of the estate, sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his kingdom. White-haired and red-faced, he spoke of his slaves the way other men discussed cattle, with casual ownership and complete humanity. To indifference to his right sat Judge Marcus Whitfield, who had sentenced more runaways to death than any man in Kentucky, always with a smile and a quote from Scripture. Across from him, Reverend Samuel Caldwell blessed their meals while cursing their property for breathing too loudly. Then there was Thomas Ashford, the slave trader whose ships brought fresh misery from the coast. His laugh could be heard 3 counties away, especially when he told stories of families torn apart at auction blocks. Beside him sat Dr. Edmund Price, who had written papers proving that dark skin meant dark souls, while his own soul had rotted black years ago. The banker, William Hartley, counted profit in human currency. The lawyer, Charles Norton, wrote contracts that turned people into property with the stroke of a pen. 8 more men filled the remaining chairs, each one a pillar of Lexington society, each one a nail in freedom's coffin. They wore their respectability like expensive cologne, masking the stench of their true business. They spoke of honor while trading in shame, of civilization while perpetrating barbarism, of Christianity while crucifying Christ daily with their actions. In the kitchen below, Josiah listened to their laughter echo through the floorboards like thunder before a storm. He had served these same men for years, watched them grow fat on food prepared by hands they would have shackled if given the chance. He knew their preferences, their weaknesses, their habits. Colonel Beaumont always ate too fast when nervous. Judge Whitfield couldn't stomach anything too spicy. Reverend Caldwell had a weak heart that fluttered with excitement whenever young girls served his wine. Tonight, Josiah would use every piece of knowledge he had gathered, every secret he had learned, every weakness he had observed. The menu had been planned not by taste, but by justice. Each dish would carry its own verdict, each flavor its own reckoning. He had spent months preparing, not just the food, but the moment when silence would finally speak. The other kitchen staff moved around him like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance. Mary, the head server, had worked alongside Josiah for 15 years. She understood his moods, his methods, his quiet intensity. Tonight, she noticed something different in his movements, a finality, as if each gesture was being performed for the last time. Young Samuel, barely 16, tended the fires with nervous energy. He had been born on the estate, knew no other life, but in Josiah's presence, he sensed something changing. The air itself felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Even old Martha, who had outlived 3 masters and thought she had seen everything, kept glancing at Josiah with curious eyes. But Josiah said nothing. He chopped vegetables with mechanical precision, stirred sauces with practiced ease, and seasoned each dish with ingredients that would have made a chemist weep. His face remained impassive, his movements fluid, his silence complete. But inside, a furnace burned that had been stoked for 18 years with every insult, every cruelty, every moment of stolen dignity. The first course would be turtle soup, rich and dark, served in bone china bowls that cost more than most people earned in a year. The second would be roasted duck with cherry glaze, the meat so tender it would fall from the bone. Then came the lamb, pink and perfect, accompanied by vegetables that had been grown by hands that would never taste them. Each dish was a masterpiece of culinary art, prepared by a master who had learned to cook hatred into love and love into justice. As the evening progressed, Josiah moved between kitchen and dining room like a shadow-serving light. He poured wine with steady hands, carved meat with artistic precision, and answered questions with respectful nods. The masters saw what they expected to see, a well-trained servant performing his duties with quiet efficiency. They never looked into his eyes long enough to see what was really there. The conversation above grew louder as the wine flowed freely. Stories of profitable transactions, successful hunts for runaways, and plans for expanding their operations filled the air like poison gas. They spoke of human beings as if they were discussing the weather, casual and indifferent to the storms they created in other people's lives. Colonel Beaumont raised his glass in a toast to prosperity, while Judge Whitfield blessed their continued success in maintaining order. Reverend Caldwell quoted scripture about servants obeying their masters, while Dr. Price expounded on the natural hierarchy of races, Each word was a whipcrack, each laugh a chain link, each toast a tombstone for someone's dreams. But in the kitchen, Josiah continued his work with methodical precision. He had waited 18 years for this moment, and he would not rush it now. Every dish had to be perfect, every flavor balanced, every presentation flawless, because this was not just a meal, it was a statement, a declaration written in spice and sauce, seasoned with memory, and served with the patience of a man who had learned that justice, like fine wine, improves with age. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Steam rose from bubbling pots like spirits ascending to heaven. And somewhere in the darkness between kitchen and dining room, between servitude and freedom, between silence and truth, Josiah Freeman prepared to serve the most important meal of his life. The clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, each note hanging in the air like a countdown to judgment. Upstairs, the laughter grew more raucous as brandy loosened tongues and wine dissolved what little conscience remained. Stories flowed like rivers of poison, each tale more horrific than the last. Thomas Ashford regaled the table with his latest acquisition, a young mother sold without her children, her screams still echoing in his ears like music. The others nodded approval, raising their glasses to celebrate another successful separation of flesh from soul. In the kitchen, Josiah's movements never faltered. He ladled soup into porcelain bowls with the precision of a surgeon, each portion measured not by volume but by memory. The turtle soup was rich and dark, its surface reflecting the candlelight like black mirrors. But beneath the familiar flavors lay something else, something that had been cultivating in hidden corners of the pantry for months. Ingredients that grew wild in Kentucky's forgotten places. Plants that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. Mary approached with her serving tray, her eyes questioning. She had worked beside Josiah long enough to read the subtle changes in his demeanor, the way his shoulders held themselves straighter tonight, the way his hands moved with ceremonial purpose rather than mere habit. But she said nothing. In a house built on silence, questions were dangerous luxuries none of them could afford. The soup course was received with enthusiastic approval. Colonel Beaumont proclaimed it the finest he had ever tasted, while Judge Whitfield complimented the complex layering of flavors. They consumed it eagerly, these men who had consumed so much else without thought or gratitude. Each spoonful was savored, each drop appreciated by palates that had grown sophisticated on the labor of others. Josiah watched from the shadows of the dining room doorway, his face impassive as carved stone. He counted each bowl emptied, each satisfied sigh, each compliment paid to his artistry. They praised his skill while planning to sell his people. They celebrated his talent while denying his humanity. The irony was not lost on him. It had been seasoning his patience for years. The second course required more elaborate preparation. Roasted duck, its skin crackling golden, stuffed with herbs that told stories older than slavery itself. The cherry glaze caught the light like liquid rubies, sweet on the tongue, but carrying undertones that spoke of different kinds of ripeness. Josiah carved the birds with theatrical precision, each slice revealing layers of flavor that had been building for hours in the oven's embrace. As he arranged the plates with artistic care, memories surfaced unbidden, his wife's hands teaching him to recognize healing herbs in the woods behind their first cabin. The way she would hum while grinding roots for medicine, her voice carrying melodies from a homeland none of them would ever see again. She had died 3 winters after their separation, sold to a plantation in Mississippi where the work was harder and the mercy scarcer. He learned of her death through whispered conversations in quarters, her name becoming another ghost to carry in his chest. But tonight, her knowledge lived through his hands. Every herb he had learned to identify, every root he had been taught to prepare, every leaf whose properties she had whispered to him in the darkness had been passed down through generations of heal of their stolen moments together. Her wisdomers, women who understood that knowledge was the only inheritance that could never be sold or stolen. The duck was devoured with even greater enthusiasm than the soup. Dr. Price declared it a masterpiece worthy of the finest restaurants in Louisville, while banker Hartley insisted it rivaled anything he had tasted in New Orleans. Their appreciation was genuine, their enjoyment complete. They ate like kings while discussing the sale of kingdoms built on human bones. Between courses, Josiah retreated to his domain, checking preparations for what was to come. The lamb rested on the cutting board like a sacrifice on an altar, its meat pink and perfect. The vegetables had been prepared with mathematical precision, each cut calculated for maximum effect. The wine had been decanted hours ago, allowing it to breathe while its intended consumers planned to suffocate others' dreams. Young Samuel stirred the fires, his movements nervous, but dutiful. He had been born into this life, knew no other reality, but tonight something in the air made him restless. The usual rhythms of kitchen service felt different, charged with electricity that made his skin prickle. He glanced at Josiah repeatedly, seeking reassurance or explanation, finding neither in the cook's composed features. Old Martha hummed while she cleaned pots, her weathered hands moving through familiar motions. She had survived 3 generations of masters, outlasted owners who thought themselves permanent fixtures in the landscape of power. Her eyes held secrets that would die with her, stories of resistance that took forms too subtle for history books to record. Tonight, she sensed something familiar in the air, something she had tasted before in moments when the oppressed became the architects of their own liberation. The conversation above took darker turns as the evening progressed. Plans were discussed for expanding their reach into new territories, strategies for maximizing profits from human cargo, methods for breaking the spirits of those who still dared to dream of freedom. Each word was a nail hammered into humanity's coffin. Each decision, a stone added to the wall of separation between those who owned and those who were owned. Reverend Caldwell spoke of divine providence, claiming that God had ordained their superiority and blessed their endeavors. His voice carried the authority of false righteousness, scripture twisted into chains, prayers transformed into whips. The others nodded in agreement, comfortable in their delusion that heaven smiled upon their earthly hell. But in the kitchen, another kind of prayer was being offered. Silent words whispered over seasoning, benedictions spoken into bubbling pots, invocations mixed with ingredients that carried the power of generations. This was not the religion of the masters, with its convenient interpretations and profitable prophecies. This was something older, deeper, rooted in traditions that predated plantation churches and slave galleries. The lamb course was Josiah's masterpiece, the culmination of skills honed over decades of unwilling service. Each slice fell from his knife like petals from a deadly flower, arranged on china plates with artistic precision. The sauce was rich and complex, its flavors building in layers that revealed themselves slowly to sophisticated palates. Vegetables provided perfect accompaniment, their colors bright against the white porcelain like jewels scattered on snow. As he prepared the final plates, Josiah allowed himself a moment of reflection. 18 years had led to this moment. 18 years of swallowed pride and suppressed rage. 18 years of watching these men grow fat on food prepared by hands they would have bound if law permitted. Tonight, those same hands would serve a different kind of meal, seasoned with justice and garnished with memory. The masters received the lamb with their usual enthusiasm, praising its tenderness and complexity of flavor. They ate with the confidence of men who had never questioned their right to consume whatever pleased them, whether food or flesh, whether dinner or dignity. Each bite was savored, each morsel appreciated by palates educated on the suffering of others. And in the shadows between kitchen and dining room, between servitude and freedom, between silence and truth, Josiah Freeman continued his work. Patient as always, methodical as ever, but carrying in his movements the weight of 18 years of accumulated justice. The meal was far from over, and the most important courses were yet to come. The dining room had transformed into something resembling a Roman feast. If Romans had built their empire on human chattel and seasoned their wine with tears. The 12 men lounged in their chairs like satisfied predators, their bellies full, but their appetites for cruelty unsated. Colonel Beaumont leaned back, his waistcoat straining against the evening's indulgences, while cigar smoke began to curl toward the coffered ceiling like incense in a temple dedicated to greed. Judge Whitfield was deep into his third glass of port, his judicial composure dissolving into the crude laughter of a man who had sentenced children to chains without losing sleep. His face had grown ruddy, not from the wine alone, but from the intoxication of absolute power. Beside him, Reverend Caldwell dabbed his lips with linen that cost more than most families saw in a lifetime, preparing to deliver another sermon on the divine order that placed him at the top and others at the bottom. But it was Thomas Ashford who dominated the conversation now, his voice carrying the theatrical flair of a man who had turned human misery into performance art. He gestured with his brandy snifter, the amber liquid catching the candlelight, as he painted pictures with words that should have chilled the blood of any creature possessing a soul. "Gentlemen, you should have witnessed the auction last Tuesday in Lexington proper," he began, his eyes gleaming with the fervour of an evangelist preaching his twisted gospel. "A fine specimen of a woman, maybe 25 years, strong as an ox and twice as useful, but she came with complications, you understand. 3 little ones clinging to her skirts like burrs on wool." The table fell silent, not from horror, but from the anticipation of men who fed on others' anguish like vampires feeding on blood. Dr. Price leaned forward, his medical training having long ago been perverted into something that measured human worth by the colour of skin and the curve of skull. "Complications indeed," he murmured, swirling his wine. "The maternal bond in that particular race is remarkably strong, almost primitive in its intensity." Ashford nodded, warming to his theme. "Precisely why I had to be creative in my approach. You see, I had 3 separate buyers, each interested in different aspects of the lot. The woman herself was destined for the cotton fields of Alabama, where her strength would serve a higher purpose. But the children, well, they presented opportunities of their own. In the kitchen below, Josiah's hands never paused in their preparations, but something shifted in the air around him. The other servants felt it too, a change in pressure like the moments before lightning strikes. Mary glanced up from polishing silverware, her instincts honed by years of surviving in spaces where wrong words meant death. Young Samuel's stirring of the fire became more aggressive, sparks flying up the chimney like escaped souls seeking heaven. Old Martha stopped humming entirely. Ashford continued his tale with the enthusiasm of a storyteller who had found his perfect audience. The eldest boy, perhaps 10 years old, showed promise for the tobacco fields of Virginia. Strong back, quick hands, and that sullen intelligence that can be beaten into usefulness with proper application. The middle child, a girl of maybe 7, had the kind of delicate features that would make her valuable in household service once she reached proper age. Banker Hartley interrupted, his commercial instincts sharper than his humanity. "And the youngest?" Ashford's smile was the kind that belonged on a serpent. "Ah, the youngest. A boy, barely 5 years old, but already showing signs of rebellion. He bit me, can you imagine? Actually drew blood from my hand when I tried to examine his teeth." The laughter that erupted from the table was not human. It was the sound hyenas might make if they had learned to speak, if they had developed the capacity for cruelty that surpassed mere hunger. It echoed through the house like a curse, seeping into the walls and staining the very air. "So naturally," Ashford continued when the laughter died to chuckles, "I had to make an example. You cannot allow defiance to take root, gentlemen. It spreads like disease if left unchecked." Judge Whitfield raised his glass in salute. Wisdom spoken like a true philosopher of commerce. The preservation of order requires occasional displays of authority. Indeed, Ashford agreed. So I informed the mother that her cooperation in the sales process would determine the fate of her youngest. A simple transaction, really. Docile acceptance in exchange for the boy's placement in a household where he might live to see adulthood. The silence that followed was pregnant with anticipation. These men had heard such stories before, had participated in similar negotiations, but each tale of broken spirits and severed bonds fed something hungry inside them that could never be satisfied. Reverend Caldwell blessed the moment with scripture. The Lord works in mysterious ways, transforming sorrow into salvation, separation into sanctification. Beautifully said, Reverend, Ashford replied. And so the woman agreed, naturally. What choice did she have? She stood silent as stone while I arranged the sales, tears streaming down her face, but her mouth sealed tight as a tomb. The buyers were pleased with their acquisitions. I was pleased with my profits, and order was maintained. Dr. Price leaned back in his chair, his medical mind already analysing the psychological implications. The trauma of separation serves multiple purposes. It breaks the spirit while demonstrating the futility of resistance. Quite efficient, really. But here's where the story becomes truly instructive, Ashford said, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone of a man sharing a particularly delicious secret. After the sales were completed, after the money had changed hands and the new owners had taken possession of their property, the woman approached me. She begged, gentlemen, actually fell to her knees in the dirt and begged for information about where her children would be taken. The table waited, breath held, for the conclusion they sensed coming like wolves, scenting blood on the wind. And I told her, Ashford said, his smile widening. I told her exactly where each child was going. The cotton plantation in Alabama, where the boy would work until his back broke. The tobacco fields in Virginia, where the girl would learn that beauty was just another commodity to be harvested. And the household in New Orleans, where the youngest would serve until his spirit was ground to dust. Colonel Beaumont slammed his palm on the table in appreciation. Magnificent. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Oh, it was, Ashford assured him. She screamed then. Not the quick scream of physical pain, but the long, hollow wail of a soul being torn from its moorings. It echoed through the auction yard like the cry of a banshee, sending shivers through even the most hardened observers. The men around the table savoured this detail like connoisseurs appreciating a fine vintage. They could almost taste the despair, almost feel the exquisite agony of a mother's heart being systematically dismantled. It was sustenance to them, nourishment for spirits that had long ago traded their humanity for profit margins and social standing. In the kitchen, Josiah's preparations took on a ritualistic quality. Each ingredient was measured not just by quantity, but by significance. Each stirring motion carried the weight of memories that stretched back through generations of stolen lives and severed bonds. The pots bubbled with more than food now. They simmered with the accumulated grief of a people who had been treated as property for so long that even their tears had been commodified. Young Samuel noticed that Josiah's lips were moving silently, forming words that belonged to languages older than English, prayers that predated plantation chapels and slave galleries. The fire beneath the pots seemed to burn hotter, casting shadows that danced like spirits waiting for justice. Mary set down her polishing cloth, her hands trembling slightly. She had heard such stories before, had lived through variations of them herself, but tonight something felt different. Tonight, the weight of accumulated suffering seemed to press against the very foundations of the house, seeking release. Old Martha approached Josiah quietly, her weathered face grave with understanding. "You sure about this path, child?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the bubbling of the pots. Josiah looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight like polished obsidian. For the first time that evening he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 18 years of swallowed words. "Mama Martha," he said, the childhood name slipping out despite his adult years. "Some paths choose us. Some debts demand payment. Some silences become too heavy to carry." She nodded slowly, recognition passing between them like a shared secret. She had seen this look before, in other kitchens, in other times when the oppressed had reached the limits of their endurance. She placed a gnarled hand on his shoulder, not to stop him, but to let him know he would not walk this path alone. Above them, the laughter continued, growing more raucous as the evening progressed. More stories were shared, each one a testament to the systematic destruction of human bonds, each tale celebrated like a military victory. They spoke of broken families with the casual air of men discussing the weather, of separated lovers with the detachment of accountants reviewing ledgers. The dessert course was yet to come, but Josiah knew that the real feast was just beginning. For 18 years, he had served these men their food while they devoured his people's humanity. Tonight, the menu would finally be complete. Tonight, the bill would come due. And in the flickering shadows of the kitchen, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the weight of his ancestors' expectations, Josiah Freeman prepared to serve the most important course of his career. Not just food, but justice. Not just flavor, but truth. Not just a meal, but a reckoning that had been simmering for far too long. The clock in the hallway chimed 10 times, each note hanging in the air like a countdown to judgment. The real feast was about to begin. The dessert course arrived on silver platters, like offerings at an altar of corruption. Peach cobbler, golden and steaming, its crust crackling with butter that had been churned by hands that would never taste its sweetness. Beside it, bread pudding soaked in bourbon sauce, the alcohol chosen specifically for its Kentucky heritage, distilled from grain grown in fields watered with tears. The final touch was a selection of pralines, their sugary perfection hiding complexities that only Josiah understood. As he arranged the desserts with ceremonial precision, the conversation above reached new depths of depravity. Thomas Ashford had launched into another tale, this one about a young man who had dared to learn reading from scraps of newspaper. The punishment had been swift and educational, Ashford explained with the enthusiasm of a teacher sharing a successful lesson plan. They had burned the newspapers in front of the boy, then burned his fingertips to ensure he would never again attempt to steal knowledge that didn't belong to him. "Education is a privilege, not a right," Judge Whitfield proclaimed, his judicial robes invisible but his authority absolute. "When property begins to think, it forgets its purpose." Dr. Price nodded sagely, his medical degree having long ago been perverted into a license for cruelty. The cranial capacity simply isn't designed for complex thought. Attempting to force learning into inadequate vessels only leads to confusion and rebellion. Reverend Caldwell blessed this wisdom with scripture twisted into chains. As the good book teaches us, there is a natural order to creation. To disturb this order is to question the Almighty himself. In the kitchen, Josiah's movements took on the quality of a sacred ritual. He spooned the cobbler onto bone china plates with the reverence of a priest offering communion. Each portion measured not by hunger, but by justice. The bread pudding followers that spoke of Kentucky, its bourbon sauce carrying Flav soil and Kentucky shame in equal measure. The pralines were arranged like jewels, their sweetness masking bitterness that ran deeper than sugar could reach. Young Samuel watched with growing unease as Josiah's preparations became increasingly deliberate. Each gesture seemed weighted with significance beyond mere cooking, each ingredient chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with taste. The fire beneath the pots burned with unusual intensity, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Mary had stopped pretending to polish silverware and now stood motionless, her instincts screaming warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The air in the kitchen had grown thick, not with heat alone, but with something more substantial. something that pressed against her chest like a physical presence, making breathing difficult and thinking dangerous. Old Martha hummed again, but the melody was different now. Not the work songs that usually accompanied kitchen labor, but something older, something that belonged to times before ships and chains and auction blocks. Her weathered fingers moved in patterns that seemed to trace invisible symbols in the air, movements that spoke of traditions maintained in secret, passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required the appearance of submission. Above, the masters had moved beyond mere storytelling into active planning. Maps were spread across the table between dessert plates, marking territories yet to be conquered, populations yet to be enslaved. They spoke of expansion with the fervour of missionaries spreading gospel, except their religion was profit, and their salvation came at the cost of others' damnation. Colonel Beaumont traced shipping routes with his finger, calculating human cargo capacities with the precision of a mathematician. The demand in Texas continues to grow. Cotton production requires constant replenishment of labour resources. Banker Hartley produced ledgers filled with figures that reduced human lives to mathematical equations. The investment potential is extraordinary. Proper breeding programs could triple our returns within a decade. Lawyer Norton discussed legislative strategies for maintaining their monopoly on human flesh. The key is framing the debate in terms of property rights rather than human rights. Constitutional law clearly protects ownership interests. Each word was a whip crack, each plan a chain link, each decision a tombstone for someone's dreams. They spoke of human beings as commodities to be traded, resources to be harvested, problems to be solved through violence and degradation. Their casual cruelty was perhaps more horrifying than their passionate hatred, because it revealed minds that had moved beyond seeing their victims as human at all. In the kitchen, Josiah began the final preparations. Hidden compartments in his pantry revealed ingredients that had been gathering potency for months, plants that grew in forgotten corners of Kentucky wilderness, roots that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. His wife's knowledge lived in these preparations, her memory guiding his hands as they had once guided his heart. The bourbon sauce required special attention. Not just any whiskey would suffice for what he intended. This bottle had been aging in darkness, its contents enhanced by additions that transformed it from mere alcohol into something far more potent. Each drop carried the weight of accumulated grievances, the concentrated essence of 18 years' worth of swallowed insults and suppressed rage. The cobbler's crust had been prepared with flour ground from corn that grew in soil enriched by tears. The peaches themselves had been selected not for sweetness, but for their ability to mask flavors that belonged to older traditions, knowledge that predated plantations and overseers and the entire machinery of human bondage. But it was the pralines that represented Josiah's masterwork. Sugar boiled to perfect consistency, nuts chosen for their ability to complement rather than compete with other flavors, and binding agents that would ensure complete absorption of his most carefully guarded secrets. Each candy was a small, perfect package of justice, wrapped in sweetness, but carrying consequences that would echo through eternity. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. His wife's hands teaching him to identify healing plants in moonlight, the way she would sing while preparing medicines for others in their community, her voice carrying melodies that seemed to call down power from stars and soil alike. She had died believing he would never have the chance to use what she had taught him, never knowing that her lessons would someday bloom into this moment of perfect retribution. The serving began with ceremonial precision. Josiah moved between kitchen and dining room like a shadow serving light, his feet silent on floors that had witnessed countless acts of cruelty. He placed each dessert with the care of a florist arranging flowers for a funeral, knowing that what appeared to be celebration would soon transform into something far more appropriate to the occasion. The masters received their desserts with the enthusiasm of children at Christmas. their sophisticated palates already anticipating the complex flavors they had come to expect from Josiah's artistry. Colonel Beaumont savored his first spoonful of cobbler, praising the perfect balance of fruit and spice. Judge Whitfield declared the bread pudding superior to anything served in Louisville's finest establishments. Reverend Caldwell blessed the pralines as gifts from heaven itself. They ate with the confidence of men who had never questioned their right to consume whatever pleased them, whether food or freedom, whether dessert or dignity. Each bite was appreciated by palates educated on the suffering of others, refined through years of feeding on flesh and souls alike, and in the shadows between servitude and liberation, between silence and truth, between patience and justice, Josiah Freeman watched his life's work unfold. The meal was finally complete, but the real feast was just beginning. 18 years of accumulated wisdom, 18 years of carefully gathered knowledge, 18 years of perfectly preserved rage had been distilled into this moment. The clock struck 11, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the dining room windows, Kentucky held its breath. The night was far from over, and the most important course was yet to be revealed. In kitchens across the South, other cooks would hear whispers of what happened at the Beaumont estate, stories that would spread like wildfire through communities that understood the difference between submission and strategy. But for now, the masters continued to eat, continued to plan, continued to celebrate their dominion over others. They had no idea that their cook had just served them more than dessert. He had served them destiny, seasoned with memory and garnished with the patient fury of a people who had been silent far too long. The reckoning had begun, one spoonful at a time. The effects began subtly, as all of Josiah's preparations were designed to do. First came the warmth, spreading through their bellies like contentment after a satisfying meal. The masters leaned back in their chairs, loosening waistcoats and breathing deeply of air that suddenly seemed thicker, more substantial. Colonel Beaumont commented on the unusual richness of the evening's fare, his voice carrying a drowsy satisfaction that spoke of perfect digestion. Judge Whitfield was the first to notice something amiss. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his brandy snifter, the crystal catching candlelight in fragments that seemed to dance independently of the flame. He attributed it to the wine, to the late hour, to the weight of judicial responsibilities that pressed constantly upon his shoulders. But deep in his chest, something fluttered like a caged bird seeking escape. Reverend Caldwell felt it next, a tightness in his throat that made swallowing difficult. His voice, usually so commanding from pulpit and dinner table alike, began to crack like ice under spring sun. The words he tried to form came out wrong, twisted into shapes that didn't match his intentions. Scripture fled from his memory, leaving behind only the echo of prayers he had never truly meant. Thomas Ashford's laughter, that booming sound that had terrorized auction blocks across 3 states, began to falter. Each attempt at merriment ended in a cough that started shallow but deepened with each repetition. His face, already flushed from wine and cruelty, took on a different hue entirely. Something between confusion and recognition flickered in his eyes as he looked around the table with growing unease. Dr. Price, trained to diagnose ailments in others, found himself unable to explain the symptoms manifesting in his own body. His pulse raced despite his seated position. His breathing grew laboured, though he had not exerted himself. The medical knowledge that had been twisted into justifications for brutality now turned inward, cataloguing changes that defied scientific explanation, yet demanded immediate attention. In the kitchen below, Josiah cleaned his implements with the same methodical precision he had used in their preparation. Each pot was scrubbed until it gleamed, each knife polished to razor sharpness, each surface restored to the pristine condition expected of a master cook's domain. But his movements carried a finality that suggested these tools would never again serve their previous purpose. Young Samuel watched with wide eyes as the sounds from above began to change. The laughter grew forced, then faded entirely. Conversations that had flowed like poison rivers now stumbled over words that seemed to stick in throats like thorns. Chairs scraped against hardwood as bodies shifted uncomfortably, seeking positions that no longer existed. Mary pressed herself against the kitchen wall, instinctively understanding that she was witnessing something that transcended ordinary human experience. The air itself seemed to pulse with energy that belonged to older powers, forces that had been sleeping but not dead, patient but not passive. Her grandmother's stories returned unbidden. Tales of justice that came not from courts or laws, but from deeper sources. Old Martha nodded with grim satisfaction, her weathered face reflecting knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood survival's true requirements. She had seen this before, not here but in other places, other times when the oppressed had reached the limits of their endurance and found resources that existed beyond the boundaries of the possible. Above, panic began to set in as the masters realized their discomfort was not temporary. Banker Hartley clutched his chest, his breath coming in short gasps that spoke of circulation suddenly restricted. The figures in his ledgers, those careful calculations of human worth, swam before his eyes like tadpoles in muddy water. Numbers that had once added up to profit now seemed to mock him with their meaningless precision. Lawyer Norton tried to speak, but found his tongue thick and unresponsive, as if the words he had used to transform people into property had finally turned against their speaker. Legal precedents fled from his mind, leaving behind only the memory of families destroyed by contracts he had crafted with artistic precision. The law that had protected his interests now offered no shelter from consequences that recognized no jurisdiction. Colonel Beaumont attempted to rise from his chair, but found his legs unsteady, his balance compromised by forces beyond his understanding. The authority that had commanded thousands of human souls suddenly seemed as insubstantial as smoke, dissipating in air that grew thicker with each laboured breath. His plantation, his wealth, his power meant nothing to the darkness that now gathered around his vision like storm clouds. The remaining masters looked to each other for explanation, for comfort, for leadership that none could provide. They who had ruled through fear now tasted terror themselves, bitter on tongues that had grown accustomed to sweeter flavours. The dining room that had hosted their celebrations of human misery now became a chamber where justice finally found its voice. In the kitchen, Josiah removed his apron with ceremonial care, folding it precisely before placing it on the wooden table where it had served him faithfully for 18 years. His movements carried the gravity of ritual completion, the satisfaction of a craftsman who had finally created his masterpiece. The silence that surrounded him was not empty but full, pregnant with the weight of accumulated grievances finally given form. The clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through a house that would never again ring with the laughter of oppressors. In the dining room above, 12 men who had built empires on human suffering discovered that some debts cannot be negotiated, some crimes cannot be legislated away, some silences eventually demand to be heard. And in the kitchen, where it all began, where 18 years of patient preparation had culminated in this moment of perfect justice, Josiah Freeman stood surrounded by the tools of his trade and the ghosts of his ancestors. He had served his final meal, delivered his ultimate verdict, and transformed his kitchen from a place of serve finally held court. The reckoning was etude into a courtroom where truth complete, but the story was far from over. Word would spread, whispers would carry, and in kitchens across the South, other cooks would remember that patience, properly seasoned, could serve justice as surely as any judge or jury. The Avenging Cook of Lexington had served his purpose, but his legacy would simmer in pots and hearts for generations yet to come. The masters of the Beaumont estate never saw another sunrise. By dawn, 12 bodies lay still in chairs that had once held the weight of their arrogance. The dining room, scene of so many celebrations of human misery, had become their final resting place. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served at the proper temperature. Word spread quickly through Lexington's shadows, carried by voices that had learned to whisper truths too dangerous for daylight. In quarters and kitchens across Kentucky, Josiah Freeman's name was spoken with reverence, fear, and something deeper. He had proven that patience, properly cultivated, could bloom into reckoning. That silence, when broken at the right moment, could speak louder than any scream. They never found Josiah. Some say he disappeared into the Kentucky wilderness, his knowledge of healing plants serving a different purpose now. Others claim he made his way north, following stars his wife had taught him to read. But in kitchens across the South, his presence lingered like the scent of spices that couldn't be scrubbed away. Every cook who seasoned with memory, every servant who stirred with purpose, carried a piece of his legacy forward. The Beaumont estate stands empty now, but the lesson remains, that those who serve remember everything, that those who suffer in silence are often the most dangerous when they finally choose to speak, and that justice, like the finest meal, is worth waiting for when prepared by hands that understand the true meaning of patience. This story burns something inside you, because it reminds us that even in the darkest kitchens, even under the heaviest chains, the human spirit finds ways to resist. If you carry in your blood the memory of those who endured, who survived, who fought back in ways history rarely records, then you understand why Josiah Freeman's name must never be forgotten.